A trail camera catches a coyote stepping onto an old logging road somewhere deep in Appalachian fog, and the proportions look wrong the moment it enters frame. The legs are heavier than they should be. The chest sits deeper. The head reads broader across the skull than the lean, narrow animal most people picture when they hear the word coyote. Some people watching footage like this call it a coy wolf. Others insist it's just an ordinary coyote, exaggerated by a bad camera angle and a thick winter coat. Both reactions are understandable, and both are also incomplete, because this question doesn't resolve into a clean yes or no once you actually go looking at the evidence behind it. The DNA gives an answer more interesting than either of those, and it takes a genuine continental migration to get there. If you've ever seen a coyote in these mountains that looked too heavy to be what you expected, put the state and county in the comments, because this entire investigation is about what that size difference actually means. Start with the animal most Americans actually picture when they hear the word coyote. Small, narrow-bodied, associated with open plains, prairie, and desert scrub out west. That image isn't wrong, historically speaking. Coyotes were concentrated far more heavily in western and central North America for most of recorded history. Then, through the 20th century, their range expanded dramatically eastward, and it didn't happen along one single path. Wolves had been disappearing from huge stretches of the eastern United States during roughly that same period. Eastern forests were being reshaped by logging and agriculture, and human-altered landscapes were opening up new ecological space at exactly the moment coyotes were pushing outward, looking for it. Coyotes moving east were not simply filling in a blank spot on a map. Different migration routes exposed them to different animals, different landscapes, and different evolutionary pressures. And one of those routes led somewhere unexpected. It carried coyotes up through the Great Lakes region, straight into contact with wolf populations that had themselves already been driven down to a fraction of their historic numbers, while a separate, more southerly front of expanding coyotes largely avoided that same contact altogether. Two fronts, two very different histories, both eventually arriving somewhere in the east, but carrying different genetic baggage by the time they got there. That contact is where this story actually starts, because the boundary between coyotes and wolves in that region was not as absolute as most people assume. As expanding coyotes moved north and east around the Great Lakes, they encountered wolves whose own populations had been badly reduced by decades of human pressure, and hybridization occurred between the two. The resulting offspring were fertile, they backcrossed into the expanding coyote population, and wolf-derived genes entered the eastward migration from that point forward. Researchers have reconstructed this specific history using 686 eastern coyote mitochondrial DNA sequences paired with measurements from 196 skulls, and the pattern that emerged was strikingly clean. Wolf hybridization showed up specifically along that northern route. The animals descended from that northern, hybridized front also carried larger skulls, greater sexual dimorphism between males and females, and an estimated colonization rate roughly 5 times faster than the separate southern expansion front that stayed largely coyote. That's a genuinely rare kind of finding. DNA, skull shape, and geography all pointing toward the same conclusion at once. It's worth being careful about what that finding actually proves, though. The study found an association between wolf-derived ancestry and faster colonization, not direct proof that the wolf genes themselves single-handedly caused the speed of that expansion. Larger body size, more resources tied up in bigger litters, or simply arriving first into unoccupied territory could all have played a role alongside whatever the DNA was doing. So when researchers eventually sampled hundreds of animals across the East directly, the signal was impossible to dismiss. A large genetic study covering 425 eastern coyotes, compared against reference wolves and western coyotes, found widespread admixture but with obvious geographic variation built into it. Populations closer to the northeast carried noticeably stronger wolf signal than coyotes sampled farther toward contact zones like Ohio. A later whole genome analysis published in 2023 reinforced that same basic picture, describing eastern coyotes as originating primarily from western coyote stock, while carrying substantial historical ancestry from eastern wolves, with more limited gray wolf contribution depending on the specific population being studied. And this is the number most people remember once they hear it. The National Park Service summarizes one large northeastern data set of 462 animals, averaging roughly 64% coyote, 13% gray wolf, 13% eastern wolf, and 10% domestic dog. Sit with that for a second, because it sounds like the whole question just got answered. Part wolf? Clearly, yes. Except those numbers describe one specific northeastern sample. They are not a universal eastern coyote formula, and they are absolutely not automatically true of a coyote standing on a ridge in West Virginia or Western Virginia. When scientists actually tested coyotes from those two states directly, the neat quarter wolf story most people repeat online started to fall apart almost immediately. It's worth remembering, too, that the northeastern number itself, 64% coyote, 13% gray wolf, 13% eastern wolf, 10% dog, is already an average pulled from hundreds of individual animals, meaning plenty of northeastern coyotes sit well above or well below that figure even within their own region. Averages hide variation, and Appalachia turned out to sit on a very different part of that variation than most people assumed going in. That study sampled 121 coyotes across Virginia and West Virginia, using nuclear microsatellite markers compared against reference canid populations from the region. The result was not half-wolf. It wasn't even a consistent quarter wolf running through the whole population. Depending on the specific analytical criteria applied, only somewhere between 6 and 16% of individual animals showed any detectable evidence of introgression from other canids at all. Overall, the Virginia and West Virginia population came back predominantly coyote, and the researchers concluded plainly that introgression had played a substantially smaller role in shaping these Appalachian populations than it had in coyotes sampled closer to the Canadian border. That distinction matters enormously, and it's worth being precise about it, because 6 to 16% of individuals showing some evidence of mixed ancestry is a completely different statement than saying the population itself carries 6 to 16% wolf DNA on average. One describes how many animals showed any detectable signal at all. The other would describe the actual genetic makeup of the population, and that is not what this study found. So, the honest answer to part wolf, once you're standing in Appalachia specifically, becomes something closer to sometimes, historically, and unevenly, which is a far more interesting answer than a clean yes. which raises the obvious next question. If Appalachian coyotes are running mostly coyote genetically, why do they still so often look and behave differently from the small, narrow-bodied Western animal most people picture? Because DNA is only half of this story. The other half is what actually happens when a prairie-adapted predator moves into a forest built entirely differently from the landscape its ancestors evolved in. Appalachia hands a coyote-dense hardwoods, steep ridgelines, old logging roads, suburban edges bleeding into timber, abundant white-tailed deer, small mammals, carrion and seasonal fruit, none of which resembles open plains hunting in any meaningful way. A coyote built by natural selection to chase down jackrabbits across open sagebrush is now navigating creek bottoms, laurel thickets, and steep hollows where visibility might only extend a few dozen feet in any direction. And that alone reshapes how, when, and what it hunts, regardless of what percentage of its genome traces back to a wolf somewhere in the Great Lakes generations earlier. Pennsylvania scat research shows exactly how far this predator's diet actually stretches, identifying mammal remains from at least 13 separate genera across sampled scats. Deer turned up in 57% of those samples, making it the single most commonly identified food category in the entire study. That number sounds dramatic on its own, and it's worth pausing on before drawing the conclusion most people jump to immediately. 57% occurrence in scat does not mean coyotes are routinely running down and killing healthy adult deer at that rate. Deer remains showing up in a scat sample can come from actual predation, but they can just as easily come from roadkill, winter mortality, hunter-processed carcasses left in the woods, scavenged remains from other causes entirely, or vulnerable fawns rather than adults. Pennsylvania's own researchers explicitly warn against assuming every trace of deer in a coyote's diet represents a kill. And that caution matters here, because it's the difference between an opportunistic omnivore exploiting whatever the forest offers and a specialized deer-hunting predator, which is a very different animal. It's also worth remembering what that 57% figure is actually measuring. It counts how often deer material showed up across the sampled scats, not what share of a coyote's total caloric intake came from deer, and not how many individual deer were involved. A single scavenged carcass, visited repeatedly over several weeks by more than one coyote, can generate far more scat samples containing deer than one single kill ever would, which is exactly the kind of detail that gets lost when a headline number gets repeated without its context. Set that alongside one more thing people commonly misread, because it deserves a direct answer before moving on. If several coyotes are showing up together on the same camera, night after night, drop that in the comments too, because what looks like pack behavior almost always turns out to be something much simpler once you actually look at who is in the group. People frequently interpret multiple coyotes traveling together as proof of wolf-like pack behavior, but coyotes were already social animals long before any wolf ancestry entered the picture. Eastern coyote groups typically consist of a breeding pair along with that pair's offspring, occasionally joined by an additional family member sticking around past the usual dispersal age, and the National Park Service specifically draws a line between that kind of family unit and the larger, more persistent, hierarchical pack structure associated with actual wolves. These family groups can cooperate, and under the right conditions, That cooperation can extend to bringing down a deer. But coyotes remain fundamentally opportunistic predators whose diet swings constantly between small mammals, fruit, insects, birds, carrion, and deer, depending on what the season and the landscape happen to offer. That flexibility, the ability to eat a mouse one week and scavenge a deer carcass the next, is arguably more responsible for their success spreading through the East than anything resembling wolf-style specialization ever could be. A true wolf pack, built around large-bodied prey and a rigid social hierarchy, would struggle to survive on the kind of scattered, low-calorie, opportunistic diet that lets a coyote family persist through a lean Appalachian winter on rodents, persimmons, and whatever carrion it happens to find along a creek bottom. Modern camera trap research in central Appalachian forests across West Virginia and Pennsylvania now treats coyotes and white-tailed deer as an active predator-prey system worth studying directly, confirming that coyote presence measurably influences deer behavior and space use in these forests, regardless of exactly how much ancestral wolf DNA any individual animal happens to carry. That kind of ecological influence does not require wolf ancestry to explain it. A resourceful, adaptable, mid-sized predator moving through a landscape thick with deer will shape how those deer move and feed, whether or not a single one of its ancestors ever crossed paths with a wolf near the Great Lakes. So did wolf ancestry actually transform this species into something functionally different? Or did it simply leave a genetic trace behind without reshaping much else? That question turns out to be far harder to answer than measuring DNA ever was. Genetic testing can confirm that historical hybridization happened. It can estimate ancestry proportions. It can identify geographic patterns tied to specific colonization routes. It can even correlate certain ancestry signatures with certain skull shapes or body sizes across a population. What it cannot do is tell you how aggressive one specific animal will be, whether that particular coyote hunts deer regularly, how large it's going to grow, whether it lives in a family group, or whether some specific behavior you just watched on camera traces back to a wolf-derived gene versus ordinary coyote biology. Those traits emerge out of a tangle of genetics, individual development, available prey, habitat structure, learned behavior, and plain environmental variation, not out of ancestry percentages alone. This is exactly where the word coywolf becomes more limiting than useful. It compresses a genuinely complicated evolutionary process, one involving multiple colonization fronts, uneven hybridization, and generations of adaptation to entirely new ecosystems into a single catchy label that implies something far more uniform and far more resolved than what the actual data shows. Most researchers working directly with these populations don't treat coywolf as an accepted taxonomic category at all, precisely because the underlying genetics are too geographically inconsistent to support drawing a clean new line around a single distinct animal. The more accurate description is an expanding coyote lineage that repeatedly brushed up against other canids along the way east, while remaining, at its genetic core, predominantly coyote the entire time. Go back to that heavy-bodied animal stepping through fog on the logging road. The first question was whether that's even really a coyote, and the answer is yes, unambiguously. The second question was whether it's part wolf, and the honest answer is sometimes genetically, depending on exactly where its ancestors traveled during that long eastward expansion. But both of those questions, on their own, miss the deeper and more interesting story sitting underneath them. Coyotes expanded across an entire continent. One migration front encountered wolves and carried the genetic consequences of that contact forward. A separate front stayed largely untouched by it. Those descendants eventually converged on landscapes filled with deer, roads, suburban edges, and ecological opportunities that share almost nothing with the open plains most people still associate with the word coyote. So the animal standing in that Appalachian forest is not a wolf quietly pretending to be something smaller. It is not simply a western coyote wearing a thicker coat for colder weather. It is the product of migration, uneven admixture, and an unusual amount of behavioral flexibility layered on top of a genome that still reads overwhelmingly as coyote. Two coyotes standing side by side on that same ridge can look almost identical while carrying meaningfully different ancestry underneath the fur. And a third animal can look enormous simply because it's an older male in prime winter coat rather than because it's carrying dramatically more wolf DNA than its neighbors. Size alone was never a reliable way to read what's actually written in the genome. As genetic sampling keeps getting finer across the region, the honest open question is how much variation might still be sitting undetected between one Appalachian valley and the next. If you've personally seen an unusually large coyote in these mountains, tell us the state, the county, roughly when it happened, whether you have any actual measured weight rather than just a visual guess, and whether the animal was alone or traveling with others. And if this kind of investigation, DNA over folklore, is what you want more of, subscribe, because Appalachia has more than one animal carrying a history like this one hiding in plain sight.